Speaking of what's important, what is our topic today?
All right, so today we're talking about NFTs, and
Wow.
it's a really cool topic, I think, especially because it seems they're almost everywhere, and there is a lot of confusion about what an NFT is and what is the blockchain. And I don't want us to take same approach to explaining things like every tech bro at every party when he starts talking about, oh, I bought Bitcoin at whatever and NFTs, this
Hmm.
project I'm supporting and things like that. So it seems like everywhere now you look in on Twitter, everybody has this bored cartoonish ape on their profile picture. I know recently you just published a paper on
Yeah,
NFTs, and congratulations for that. So
thank you.
I'm gonna act as if I am the 5-year-old child, or maybe the fifth grader, maybe not really a 5-year-old, and I'm gonna
Huh.
have you take the lead on explaining what NFTs are and what your research was about around them. We'll
Wow.
go from there.
Okay, I am honored. Thank you. Yeah, we have been doing like research, I guess scientific research or academic research on this topic. It actually is part of a sort of grander project. It's like a larger kind of scale of thinking that we have research funding for. So it's an ongoing project where we have these students and the professor from KTH, from Stockholm Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden, and myself. We are involved in this project, which is running for the duration of a PhD because it's funding our PhD students. And the topic at large that we're looking at is digital preciousness. So the kinds of things that we value in the real world. If you think about, certain kinds of objects that we have, certain kinds of belongings, maybe it's something that's handed down to you from your family, or maybe it's something that's expensive and beautiful and nice that you sort of really coveted for a while and then finally got it. I have this watch from 1971, which used to be my dad's. So those kinds of artifacts in the real world, these exist, okay? But what is the equivalent of these things in the digital world? Is it even possible? What are the kinds of, technologies, design parameters involved in creating things like this? And even if we are successful in creating these things, what is the use of these things? Like what is the actual value, I guess, of having precious things, rare things, but belongings in the digital world? So that was kind of the thinking, the philosophy behind our research and where it got started. It actually started before this whole, NFT sort of phenomenon was hyped up. It was in like 2018 that we were writing about this sort of design approach in terms of how can we create preciousness and valuable artifacts and objects in the digital world. That was the question. And in response to that question, we had identified the blockchain as a, let's call it, a design material. So if you are going to have precious objects in the digital world, then that has kind of, the blockchain is a good material to kind of implement that and design that
Oh,
on top of. That was our conclusion at the first stage.
would you say it's a material or more of a medium, a design medium? How would you
So
define the role that the blockchain will be playing in this
yeah,
space?
we use the word material because there's a lot of discourse, there's a lot of design philosophy that has been written up already around the notion of materials in creating digital objects and digital experiences. So, designers, graphic designers, for example, use, pen and paper and ink and printing and so on as their materials, for example. What about digital designers? How is materiality happening in their world, and what is exactly their materials that they're
Mhm.
designing with? That is a topic that, many academics and design philosophers and designers also, they think and talk and write about that. So that was the kind of terminology or intellectual framework that we wrote on top of when we made the argument for it as a material. You could call it anything else. You could, call it a platform, call it a medium,
Yeah.
but it's
No,
just
I see your point there, and I think
mm,
material makes more sense for the blockchain than a medium. So a medium would be like the difference between something that is written in text versus a an image versus a moving
mm,
image, which is or a video.
yeah.
So a material or a platform really well describes what the blockchain is.
Yeah, but also like different communities call these things different names. If you look at arts, visual arts, painting and so on, they talk about media. So the canvas or the wood or paper or whatever you're
That's true.
painting on, that's called the media.
Yeah.
In product design, in graphic design, we call them materials. But so yeah, I've been doing research on NFTs basically, and I'm not doing it alone. I'm collaborating with various peers. It actually started even back when I was a PhD student at Koç University, and I developed the initial ideas together with my colleagues and my professors over there at the first. But if we sort of come back to today, we were thinking about this idea of digital preciousness and so forth, and then it actually became a reality, which was it was an interesting feeling to see that, because I was in 2008, we were talking about these idea of, you can have rare objects, precious objects and artwork and, your sort of valuable belongings and whatnot on the blockchain. And a couple of years later, it actually has become a reality, and it has become a massive, massive sort of business phenomenon and market. And we, as the academics who were working on these ideas two years ago, were absolutely not involved in any stage of that, which was sort of a sobering, and it was an interesting experience to see that. But that's the topic for another day, the sort of the connections between academic work and, like, quote unquote, the real world and whatnot. If we return to the topic, we've recently been doing two things in tandem. So we have a multi-year kind of research project where the intention is to design different artifacts that capitalize on, like, digital preciousness, and try out different use cases and prototypes and so on. And the, like, product design takes a long time. Like, if you want to make something and put it into people's hands and study the experience of using that and do that kind of research, which you were alluding to. So human computer interaction and interaction design and product design research requires you to, at least in the way that we like to do it, it requires you to have a refined, complete kind of product design, at least some kind of MVP present. And doing that in our world takes a bit of time. Maybe the first 1 year or 2 years of the project, that is not sort of a possibility in the setup that we're working in. But during that time, we have started out by doing research for design. So even though the schedule to do the actual design work is sort of lies ahead of us, at this moment, we have been doing a lot of kind of desk research and paperwork and looking into ideas and working on different sketches and concepts and building collaborations and so on. And one of those things involves understanding this ecosystem, understanding the materials, the current players, the people that we might be designing for.
I think we should take a step back and try to explain what the technology is and what you saw from that desk research that you were mentioning.
Yeah.
So, what is the blockchain? What is an NFT? And then, just to tee you up here, the argument that sort of everybody who just hears about it a little bit, that they go, well, how is this different than a regular? What if I take a screenshot of it? How is that different? What gives it really that value? You were talking about, heirlooms and things that you inherit. So, like, I have,
Yeah.
like you, I have an Omega watch from my grandfather from, like, the 1950s.
Wow.
What would that look for my grandkids in 2070? What can I pass down to them that will have the same value in the digital sense? How are we reshaping what we can pass down to our future generations?
We can definitely start with the basics. Like, the blockchain is kind of a database technology. Basically, it is a distribute, like, a lot, like, everyone basically understands what databases are these days. It's a computer sort of storage system that you have data in a computer, and that's a database. The blockchain is a particular way of doing that, where you distribute the data across a lot of different computers in a network, so that if one of those computers goes down, your data is still available, it's still accessible. So if you imagine, you do business with your bank, you keep your money in the bank, and everything, all of your transactions happens through a single bank account. If your bank is unable to function during any given day, then you're not going to be able to pay for anything. You're not going to be able to receive money. All of your transactions will come to a halt. So to guard against that kind of problem, and also other kinds of problems which relate to, like, computer security and synchronizing sort of records between, so a lot of technological things.
Sure.
This sort of whole blockchain thing basically is a way of keeping records,
Yeah.
and it's decentralized and cryptographically secured.
Okay, so we just threw a whole bunch of really
Yeah.
complicated words. So let's try to break those down. So essentially, let's say really simplify it. Say you have an
Mm.
Excel file,
Yeah.
and it's tracking who's done whatever chores, and it is
Yeah.
saved on your home computer. And
Yeah.
say you and let's say you have a whole number of roommates. You all do an entry of who did the dishes last,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
it's saved in that Excel file. Well,
Yeah.
okay, what if, the computer you all are using dies down or something
Yeah.
like that, and you lose that record?
Yeah.
But so what happens with the blockchain is that each one of you on your own computers,
Yeah.
you have the same exact file, and you all
Exactly.
authenticate that that file actually, that each transaction. So when roommate X does the dishes and they come in and they say I did the dishes, you
Mm.
all authenticate and you all say yep, roommate X did actually do the dishes, and you
Mm.
update that same file that lives
Yeah.
on all of your devices. Is that a
Yeah.
fair explanation of how the blockchain works?
It is. I mean, there's a lot of different ways of explaining it. There's a lot of different things that it does and a lot of different problems that it solves, but it all boils down to record keeping. So it's a reliable record of what is happening, and it's public and open and auditable. So it's great for like monetary transactions because these are already supposed to have some level of auditability and
Mhm.
openness and standardization and so on. That's why the first blockchains, the Bitcoin blockchain, for example, started with like financial transactions. By the way, all kinds of recording technologies throughout history actually start with financial transactions. If you think about writing, the first writing systems, the first like tablets and marking symbolic sort of alphabet kind of systems were developed for keeping track of grains and farming and taxes.
Right.
So accounting kind of leads the way, and then it is other forms of text, and then it is images, and then audio and video and so on.
Yeah.
So all kinds of media, all kinds of recording technology throughout history have this sort of progression in terms of how they evolve.
Yeah, like they say, you got to follow the money. And
Yeah.
speaking of money, and we mentioned security. So if I'm very novice and I don't know anything about the blockchain, and you said, "Oh,
Mm.
it's public, it's open, anybody can audit it." What if
Yeah.
I don't want, my personal information or my personal identity or what I'm
Mm.
spending money on to be, out in the public for anybody to see? So
Uh,
how does that
that
work?
is in most blockchains, in most practical applications, that is handled with anonymity. So we know, about anonymity. Anonymity is basically, you're doing things, but I don't know who you are. Like
Mhm.
you're out there doing certain things, and I know that someone is doing something, but I don't know who that is. That's anonymity. Pseudonymity is that I know who it is. It is a name, but it's like it's a fake name. So I don't know it's you. Like the character that's robbed the bank yesterday and the axe that is sitting across me today, the person that I'm talking to, might be the same person. But if you've done the other act pseudonymously, then I don't know that those people are the same people. So that's how people guard their anonymity on the blockchain. Yes, it is open, but the entity, the username that is doing things on the blockchain and your physical identity are not strongly connected in an open and sort of auditable fashion in many cases. Other
Yeah.
blockchains have features in terms of like cryptographically obfuscating or ciphering the transactions, the data that is happening. There are various technical solutions that people are developing, but the most common way that people avoid that problem is by using a username that cannot be traced back to them.
I see. So essentially, you mask your identity. So,
Yeah,
for example, you're spending the money and you're buying something as Bruce Wayne, but anybody on
yeah,
the blockchain is seeing that Batman
yeah,
did
exactly.
some transaction, and they can authenticate that happened. But you're the only person who knows that Bruce Wayne is Batman.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool, cool.
Yeah. That brings us to NFTs because
Yeah.
now we have a recording system. We have a database, and in this database, we can write different kinds of things, right? So the first blockchains, the first cryptocurrencies and whatnot, obviously they're called currencies. So they sort of started out by developing this database for writing financial transactions, numbers inside of it. Later, once the sort of the next iteration, the next evolution of the technology became such that arbitrary text could be written in the blockchain. So we sort of first we figured out how to do Excel, on the blockchain, writing numbers, keeping a spreadsheet of things. Then we basically found out that we can write whatever. We can write poetry, we can write books, and by extension, then of course you can also write computer code.
Of
And then
course.
you can
Once,
run that code, and then it
yeah.
becomes a computer.
Of course, once you can save any characters someplace, you can save zeros and ones. You get a machine to
Exactly.
translate those zeros and ones, and it become anything digital.
Exactly. So now that is the sort of level, that is the operational sort of platform or material that we're working on. On top of that, so imagine, we have this database or this library of computer programs that we can write, and we can call them, we can run them from anywhere in the world. NFTs are basically a kind of data that is written in the blockchain, which is it's managed by these computer programs that we put in the blockchain. They're called smart contracts, by the way. So that's the name of a piece of computer code that runs on the blockchain. It's if once you have a computer program, a script that you save on the blockchain, then it's called a smart contract. And NFTs are a particular kind of data that is stored on the blockchain, which is managed, written and sort of edited and updated by a particular kind of smart contract. And it's all actually standardized. So there's the idea of there's like the idea of the NFT. There's the idea of what it could be and what all the things it could represent and all the forms that it could take and all the things that you could do with it and so on. But there's also, we have to understand that there's a particular technical standard. There's a particular format for how NFTs should be. It is a piece of data. It's basically a data structure that contains particular fields, and it's defined in a technical document, which is called the ERC 721 technical standard.
Oh, what a name.
Yeah. It's part of the Ethereum ecosystem, which is the blockchain database, the blockchain ecosystem that hosts more than 90%, probably 99% of the NFT market on top of it. So most NFTs in the world, the vast majority are built on the Ethereum system using Ethereum smart contracts and the Ethereum technical standards. And that's what we're talking about most of the time when we are talking about NFTs.
Sure. So back to the blockchain itself. So the blockchain, like you said, it is called the Ethereum blockchain, which is the platform where the majority of the NFTs that we see, like the Bored Apes, like whatever, live on it. And essentially, like we said, it is a database, and it is auditable, and it is decentralized and across a lot of computers. Can we dive into how does one add an NFT to the Ethereum blockchain? What happens there? How is it authenticated? And say, like we're going back to the example that I mentioned about the roommates, and how when roommate X added a new line to the Excel file, everybody said, yes, roommate X did do that. So anytime somebody puts a new record, does that mean everybody on the network has to go over that record, that smart contract, and sign it, and then go and authenticate the entire history of the Ethereum network? How does that work?
There are different kinds of, so they call this a consensus algorithm, and there are different kinds of consensus algorithms that different blockchains implement. People may have heard of like proof of work, proof of stake, proof of this, proof of that. So and it's also like a topic of active development. Like people are very actively working on this problem and developing sort of better ways of establishing this kind of consensus. But the way that it is done today is basically, it's sort of like a timekeeping mechanism almost, by continuously sort of comparing records and trying to solve certain cryptographic problems. These computers, on the network, the different nodes are essentially solving a timekeeping problem where they are trying to figure out the sort of the order of the different transactions that are incoming and being it's actually I don't have a good way of explaining it. There are other resources, other sort of documents and people out there on the internet that can do a better job than me, but that's sort of the technological substrate of it. So that's maybe one layer below
So one last note on the technical level before we
hmm,
jump up to the cultural and social impacts of NFTs. You mentioned all these nodes that are constantly working to basically run very complex algorithms to make
hmm,
sure that the authenticity of whatever proof of work and all those things. Are those what are known as miners? And that's what gas fees are associated with it because they require
yeah,
a lot of computing power essentially to make
yeah.
sure that those things are authentic.
Exactly. I mean, they are called miners, but what they are doing more is like maintaining the system, maintaining the database, and verifying, whose transactions are authentic and whose transactions are not. And the gas fees, part of the gas fee does go to the miners as a reward in some blockchains. So there's different ways of ensuring this, and what you're talking about is one way of doing that.
I've seen a lot of pieces out there talking about the ecological tax of the blockchain, and I know that the Ethereum network they're working on new algorithms to basically speed up those processes, requiring less energy to run it.
Yeah, almost all of the technologies developed by human have some kind of ecological impact. If you think about industrialization, if you think about, today, like people talk about the ecological impact of NFTs because it's relatively easy to estimate in different ways because it's all running on the computers and it's all sort of relatively open data that you can run sort of simulations, approximations on, but no one can approximate the environmental and resource impact of a bank, for example. Can you imagine like whatever bank like Citibank or Bank of America or whatever bank you work with, like in Europe we have, Handelsbanken, for example, in Sweden. If you consider that as an entity, a blockchain is basically doing some of the functions that are being done by that entity. So how
Yeah.
does that energy consumption, resource consumption, and all of that compare to the same thing being done by a corporation, being done by people, being done by more traditional systems versus being done on the blockchain? I haven't come across anyone who has actually made that kind of comparison. But of course, there are environmental impacts, as with all technologies.
Yeah, of course. And to your example of an entity, and a lot of companies, especially like big companies, are trying to be like carbon neutral by 2030 or something like that. But I have no idea into their inner workings or how they're measuring that. Are they also measuring the number of workers that they have that actually commute and how they're commuting? Are they, taking the bus or are they driving? Are they
Yeah,
carpooling? So that's a whole different discussion for a different episode.
exactly.
So let's go up a level and go to the NFTs themselves. And also, I don't know if we mentioned what NFT stands for. So let's
Yeah.
start with that and let's work with an example and see like what kind of work you've been doing around that.
Well, the NFT stands for a non-fungible token. A token is just a fancy word for an entry in the blockchain database. It's like a line in your Excel file. That's what a token is. The non-fungible means that these entries in your database represent unique and qualitatively different things, entities. These could be, artwork, these could be songs, these could be buildings, streets, people, but they represent something. If you think about it, all computer data, almost all computer data is like a representation of something that is in the real world. And then, or maybe these days it's not true, but back in the day when they were talking about databases and classes in programming, they used to say, hey, this, so they give you the example of a person has a name, height, weight,
Yep.
hair color, whatever, those different properties, and that's
Yep.
sort of like a line in your Excel file. Anyway, a fungible token would be something like a currency. That's like the standard example of it, where it's only a number, like 5 Bitcoin, 10 Bitcoin, it's all Bitcoin. One Bitcoin and the other Bitcoin are the same. Non-fungible things, unique sort of things, they represent things that are not exchangeable with each other. So you have a photo hanging on your wall, for example. I have this other sort of print kind of thing hanging on my wall, and they are not the same, even though they are both framed prints and they are representable by a line in a database. They are qualitatively different. So one line is going to be Axis print, one line is going to be byTas print, and then um, that's the property of non-fungibility, basically. Now, non-fungible tokens, as we use them today, are as I said, a particular format of an entry. So if you imagine it as an Excel file, the format, what we call the technical standard, the ERC 721, in some ways defines the names of the columns in your Excel file. It defines what fields or what kinds of properties you're going to have on this piece of data. And you can actually easily it's not a very long document. It's not like an unreadable sort of long technical sort of thing. It's just like one page. If you look at the technical standard itself, of different properties, different things that you need to implement in this data. So to call it an NFT, to write an NFT, a non-fungible token, into the Ethereum blockchain, it needs to have this parameter, and this parameter. So that's like the high level basics of sort of what it is. The way that these things are created happens by way of smart contracts, and those also are defined in the technical standard. So you don't go into the Excel file to write your own NFT data. You run that program, and that goes into the Excel file and writes your data or changes it and so on. And all of these things are defined in a technical standard. So that's like the high level of it. I guess the next question will be, well, then, like, what is contained in these things? What is the content of this line of information? The content is, as it is defined today, the content, the important piece of content that you need to have in this thing is a pointer. It's a URL. So the actual data of your image or song or real estate certificate or whatever that you want to represent on the blockchain, that you want to save onto the blockchain, is represented by a URL.
So it has an address of where it lives to go and view it.
Exactly. So if you imagine it as an Excel file, it basically, the most simplified way of thinking about it would be like 3 columns. One of the columns is just the name of the thing. It's a number, identifier, whatever. Actually, it's not so important for our case. But the second column would be the owner of this.
Yeah.
So it's either you or me or someone who's
Batman, because it's probably going to be a masked identity.
Yeah. And then the third column would be a URL, a pointer
to where it lives,
takes you to where it lives. If you want to get a little more complicated than that, there's actually a format for the data, for the information that you should find at that URL. And inside of that, there's also another URL which sort of points you to the actual assets.
Let's keep it with the simplified format. So on that Excel file, there is this identifier, whatever, whoever made this NFT, and then where that NFT lives. So essentially, I go and follow that URL to be able to view the NFT itself.
Yeah, basically that's what happens. And yeah, that's the technical sort of story of it. But aside from the technology, I mean, NFTs, especially in the last year, have been a technological phenomenon, but also a cultural and economic phenomenon. And it's a social phenomenon too, which actually conveniently brings me to our research, where we wanted to sort of approach this topic of NFTs as human-computer interaction researchers, which to me implies thinking not only about technology, but also in terms of the human dimensions of it. And what are the human dimensions? Well, the human dimensions are the sort of psychological dimensions of why people are doing the things that they're doing in this ecosystem and partaking in this phenomenon, the economic dimensions of it, which has to do with why people are buying and selling and doing exchanges and doing various kinds of productive collaborations with each other, and work is happening, and professional activity and economic activity is happening on this sort of ecosystem. There's the sociological aspects of it, where all of these things are not done in isolation by people. They are being done by groups of people, different communities, different interest groups coming together. And that's actually very interesting, because this recording technology, by way of some of those advances and some of those applications, actually has a potential to become a technology for human coordination. And by technology of human coordination, I mean things like, nation states, for example, are a technology for coordinating people, companies, religions, football teams, all of these different ways of assembling, organizing people. There are now blockchain native ways of organizing people and keeping records of human activity and sort of directing human activity that are happening.
All right. So you mentioned a lot of really cool applications and a lot of
Mm.
different ways we can use this technology that we've spent a lot of time talking about right now. Could you dive deeper into how one of these examples would work?
There's a point in our research where we kind of had discovered some answers to that question, even though that was not originally the question that was asked. So we were trying to make sense of this thing and to enable also to other researchers to make sense of it. From my perspective, I did some of this research and some of these publications and writing about NFTs and so on, so that the other people in our team also would better understand. That was why we did some of those things. But the way that we systematized that, the way we turned the sort of the intention of making sense of NFTs into kind of an operational research question was by considering the stakeholders in the ecosystem. So we do, in the world of HCI and UX design and these things, we talk about stakeholders. We talk about the people that are impacted by our designs, that use our designs and sort of surround the whole phenomena of the artifacts that we are creating. And we looked at this ecosystem, we looked at the NFT phenomenon, and the way that we sort of systematized and turned our curiosity into scientific research
Yeah.
was to operationalize in the question of who are the stakeholders here, like what kinds of stakeholders are we looking at, how would we categorize them, and what do they want, what are their motives, why are they here, why are they buying and selling and creating or whatever they're doing with NFTs, why are they doing these things. When we ask that question to data, so we mined data out of Hacker News actually to do this research, and we read, like, I personally read at least 200 articles from Hacker News and did
Wow.
analyses on a giant Excel sheet and so on. But we discovered that there are, like, was it five, one, two, three, four, with like six, actually, six different kinds of stakeholders, different kinds of people who partake
Yeah.
in this ecosystem.
So what were those personas? What were those six personas?
Now, these are not very exact because people can move between them and
Of course, yeah.
sometimes occupy them at the same
But
time.
found six archetypes
Yeah,
of people.
exactly. Those were artists and creators. That was the first one. The second one was NFT owners, of course. The third was startups and investors. And we grouped them together because their motivations are often groupable, they're similar and distinct from the other players. We had developers, engineers, technical people as a particular kind of stakeholder. We had auction houses, which was a surprising and interesting finding because the way that people looked into this ecosystem and talked about it before did not incorporate that as a significant stakeholder. But we found in our data that they play a very interesting role. So auction houses, that was the fifth one. And the final one we called corporates. So these are more established companies in the world. Think about like Nike, Coca-Cola, Microsoft, like public companies, large and sort of long-lasting business institutions that are somehow touching this ecosystem. So that was
Sure.
the categories.
So how did the established corporations differ from the startups? And the startups were
Yeah,
grouped with another persona. What was that?
investors.
Investors. Okay.
Yeah, they differed in that the corporations are more kind of reactionary. They are not creating this ecosystem. They are not, I mean, they sometimes do, invest in this ecosystem in various ways. And we did identify four examples of how they might do that. For example, they might do a shift in brand strategy. Imagine, Facebook turning into Meta or Square turning into Block. So you rebrand the whole company, you rebrand a significant part of your operation, redo all of your marketing in order to capitalize on this trend, on this technology, or to significantly sort of engage with it. Another
Yeah.
thing that they may do in a reaction could be integrating NFTs into your products. A lot
Like
of
Nike just recently bought a company they were specialized in like NFT sneakers. And I know, like, saying that NFT sneakers, like what does that even mean? But it's more like that's when the gaming aspect and the
yeah.
whole idea of having a virtual world and going into the metaverse. But that's a
Yeah.
discussion for a different episode.
Yeah, that's actually an example of how they take part in the ecosystem. So they make marketing investments by, investing in agency or studio to create something for them, collaborating with different startups and agencies and so on, or they can just straight up buy an NFT company and so on. And finally, another example of how our corporates take part in the ecosystem is by being disrupted. So they are incumbents in the business of media, for example. They are doing business in a traditional established way, but their business is being disrupted by this new technology. So those were the kind of examples of how these people touch this ecosystem.
All right. So can we run back through them?
Yeah.
Just the bullet points of who are the six main stakeholders of
Yeah.
NFTs?
Artists and creators, NFT owners, startups and investors, developers, auction houses, and corporates. That was
That's a
our
really cool.
classification.
Yeah, that's a really cool application.
The interesting thing was that once we found this classification, and then we started asking, okay, what are these people doing? Like, why are they here, and what is their engagement with this ecosystem all about? There we started finding answers to other questions about NFTs. So we found like 8 different kinds of artists and creators, different kinds of people who might want to create or who are creating NFTs and marketing, selling NFTs for different purposes. We found the different examples of why people own NFTs and other kinds of worrying features actually about NFT ownership, because in our data, it was really interesting that the owners of NFTs, if you count the occurrences of how they were represented in our data, which come from blogs and online magazines and a couple of scientific publications, and so different kinds of online media articles.
Is your
And
data set publicly available?
it is from Hacker News. It's described in the paper. I will upload a preprint of the paper on my website. So at bytosh.net/research, there will be a preprint that kind of describes the process of how we did it and the results and everything. We found was that NFT owners are very frequently represented in this data, sometimes implicitly, because a lot of articles, for example, talk about these high profile sales of NFTs where, someone sells something for like $2 million and it becomes news because, wow, it's so expensive and whatever. There's a lot of these reports and reports about the market and people buying and selling, ownership activity happening. But the actual accounts of the owners themselves, which sort of happens by way of like profiles, interviews, stories, describing what people are actually doing with NFTs, were very, very, very rare. And the most salient examples were stories of, scams and fraud and other kinds of victimhood that happens. Those were the stories that were prominent. Now, this doesn't mean that this is what the real world looks like. Again, we're looking at a particular data set and we're making sort of an analysis of the representation of this world as represented by these 200 articles that we analyzed.
Of course, but that's how scientific research happens. You take a
Yeah.
sample of a population and you study it. Assuming a normal distribution, then that sample should be representative of the real world.
Yeah. So that was an interesting and worrying, to be honest, feature that we found, because there's many use cases theoretically that people are talking about. There are use cases that investors are talking about. There are different startups, different companies that are trying to market different use cases, but the real world usage of these things was very, very rare. And the significant proportion of economic activity and the significant sort of attention grabbing hype activity in this space appears to be speculative trading, but we don't really know what exactly that proportion is in terms of what are people buying NFTs to use them for a certain purpose, or just to put on their VR goggles and go to their virtual art gallery and sit there and have a virtual coffee or whatever. Is that why they're buying them, or is it just because number go up? We don't know the proportion of that.
So you mentioned, are people buying the NFTs to use them? How would you use an NFT?
Yeah, so some examples of those include obviously games where certain functional items like swords or helmets or whatever, or kittens like in the CryptoKitties game, or land or apartments or whatever, are represented by NFTs, and actually the records of who owns what is kept through a blockchain database. So that exists. That is a real use case. So game items. And another thing is event tickets, which is easily something that would very well fit the technology. And we have seen anecdotal evidence. So people told me about certain events that they went to where NFT-based ticketing was actually being applied and implemented at certain industry conferences, for example, to get into like after conference parties and so on. You had to have this NFT and you could trade them, and different experiments that these people were doing in those spaces.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. I wonder like what the speed is to authenticate an NFT on the fly when you're like if you're using it as a ticket to be admitted
Hmm.
to a an event.
Yeah, it's
You're
very fast. It's
okay.
instantaneous. It's just the same as happening on the internet. Writing things to the blockchain takes a bit
Yeah.
of time because different computers need to coordinate different things. But reading something from the blockchain is actually very easy. It's just like visiting any web page on the internet. So it's
Yeah.
not different from scanning a QR code.
It's like scanning a QR code. Okay.
Yeah.
So if I bought a ticket to a concert and it came as an NFT
Mm.
that is like a scannable, like a QR code that can be scanned, and somebody
Yeah.
took a screenshot of that,
Yeah.
would that still work, or is there a more like is there more a layer another layers of security where I
You,
can do the authentication at the door to
yeah.
prove that I actually bought the ticket and it's not just an image of a ticket?
Yeah, you can definitely do a lot of different kinds of authentication, custom, implementations of that.
Yeah.
Like my gym, for example, has an app that it doesn't use NFTs, but it has a QR code to get into the gym, and the
Yeah.
QR code refreshes itself every 10 seconds or whatever. So if you take a picture of it, it doesn't work anymore. It's like a live updating algorithmic QR
Okay.
codes. All of those things are possible. I don't know how they did it. Maybe it might have been just like a texting and you show it to some guy at the door and they
Yeah.
look at it. I don't know how they actually did it, but that was a sort of that was a use case. More common actually is to access virtual spaces and to access communities and clubs. Board Ape Yacht Club is actually a great example of this because it sort of grants you membership into sort of a club. I don't know what happens in that club. I'm not a member of any NFT club, so I don't know if they actually work or whatever, but that is something that people do. Profile pictures, obviously, you just have it as a picture that you show off on the internet, and it symbolizes, it's a status symbol, it's a prestige symbol in a way.
Yeah.
It's a social kind of symbol signaling different things like, being innovative or being wealthy in some ways, or being an entrepreneur. I think one interesting use case, if you can call it a use case, was that the NFTs, which are usually connected to some kind of artwork, some kind of aesthetic artifact that relates to, culture and taste and so on, facilitates human connections. In the past 2 years, we've had social distancing, we've had quarantines, isolation. We could not bond with other people over culture. Examples of that would be, going to a concert, going to an art gallery, things like that, which you would do with your friends, or you would do, and then you would make friends over there because you go to a concert and the friends of your friends are there and so on. So it facilitates social interaction. NFTs have been facilitating a lot of that online. A lot of people have been bonding over their shared tastes and in the culture and aesthetics of these artifacts on the internet. And the price that you pay to buy an NFT, in some ways, you can consider that as the cost of doing that, just as it costs you money to get off your couch and go to a concert. You have to pay for the cab, you have to pay for the ticket, you have to pay for drinks and whatnot. If you want to socialize with someone in a different continent over your shared liking of these pictures, then buying the NFT is the price you pay for doing that. It is also a payment system. It's used as a payment system. It is not a payment system, but it sort of replaces one where, for example, people who own cryptocurrency already can make payments to artists and creators and other creative people. Like you can hire a designer and pay them with Bitcoin or Ethereum, or like you can buy an NFT from them, which
Yeah.
essentially means that you're paying them. So that kind of thing is facilitated, and for some people that's preferable than using like money. So those were some examples. We have a couple more in the paper, but those are like the main kind of
All right.
value propositions, we call them.
I would like to hear your closing thoughts on NFTs.
Yeah, good question. My closing statement would be like, I'm personally very excited, very interested in this whole technology, in this whole idea, because it is, as I said, a new technology for record keeping and coordinating people, which is a very powerful thing. Like if you think about other technologies which serve these same like the idea of the recording system as that I'm talking about actually comes from the work of Virgil Abloh, who was a designer and architect and sort of cultural, I guess, icon, who passed away recently. But he has lectured about his design philosophy, and he talks about recording systems, and he talks about fashion, for example, the fashion shows that they have in Paris every year or every season, whatever, being a particular kind of recording system. And he talks about sort of writing his creativity or his sort of vision into that recording system and getting that into human history. So this now is a new way in which we can write things and put things into the recording systems of humanity and human history. And it's a new one. So it's very exciting to me for that reason. And I'm really looking forward to the new technologies that are going to be built on that. And I'm experimenting with building some of my own. I hope that in the next couple of years, we will sort of unveil new experiments and new, possibly even products that we're currently working on in that space. But that's what excites me. I actually don't own any NFTs other than the ones that I've created as experiments.
Thanks so much
Cool.
for coming on and talking with me about NFTs, and we should keep this going.
It's a pleasure. Thanks a lot.